Good morning, everyone. My name is Kathleen Newland. I'm the co-founder and a senior fellow here at the Migration Policy Institute in Washington, and I'd like to thank you for joining us on this call. Our topic is Beyond Asylum, Adapting the Global Protection System to Better Meet Escalating Needs. And I'm delighted to have two panelists joining me today to discuss this very pressing topic. One is a distinguished academic who has written extensively about refugee protection. The other is the cutting edge of innovation in refugee assistance. Betsy Lippman is Chief of Operational Solutions and Transition Section in the Division of Program Support and Management at the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. And Katie Long is a visiting fellow at Stanford University and an honorary fellow at the University of Edinburgh. I'm going to just make a few housekeeping comments before we start in on the substance of our discussion. First, I'd like to remind everyone that the audio from the webinar and the slides will be on our website later today. Tell your colleagues you think might be interested that they can access the audio at migrationpolicy.org/events. The reports on which some of our discussion today is based can be found on our website at www.migrationpolicy.org. If you go to the Initiatives menu and go to the Transatlantic Council, the first thing you'll see are a series of related reports from our series on examining the global protection system. These include a paper by myself called Rethinking Global Protection, New Channels, New Tools, and one by Katie Long entitled From Refugee to Migrant, ? Labor Mobility's Protection Potential. You'll also find a paper by the former Deputy High Commissioner for Refugees, Alex Alenikov, called From Dependence to Self-Reliance, Changing the Paradigm in Protracted Refugee Situations. And these papers will all allow you to go into greater depth on some of the issues that we'll be discussing today. If you have technical problems with accessing the webinar, please email events@migrationpolicy.org or call area code 202-266-1929. That's a U.S. number. We found the best browsers to access the webinar are Google Chrome or Firefox. And if you have problems hearing via the web, please dial in using the call information sent to you via email. After a short introduction to the topic, I'll have a conversation with Betsy and Katie, and then we will open the call to your questions and comments. For the Q&A toward the end of the call, please type any questions into the Q&A or the chat box on the right side of your screen, or email your question to events@migrationpolicy.org. There will not be a voice Q&A, so please use the Q&A or chat boxes or email. So the topic that we're addressing today arises from a real sense of crisis in the international system of protection and assistance for refugees and other displaced people. It's under unprecedented strain. The UNHCR's annual assessment of the refugee and displaced person situation this year pointed out that there were about 60 million people displaced. They're overwhelmingly in developing countries which can't sustain the number of people who've been forced to flee. Probably the most dramatic example of this is in Lebanon currently, where something upwards of a quarter of the population of Lebanon is now made up of refugees. The traditional way for the international community to deal with refugees and other displaced persons has been based on the assumption that their needs are short-term, that they've been displaced by a war or a dramatic episode of repression or conflict, and that they will need to be cared for in an interim period, after which they'll be able to go home. This is not the reality today. Half of the people who are under UNHCR's mandate today have been displaced for 5 years or more, some of them for much more. And the care and maintenance regime that has been the sort of template in the past is just not capable of sustaining that number of people for such long periods of time. This change is really the basis of the crisis, and there I want to just touch on some of the underlying dynamics of this change. Some of these are not new at all. In fact, they are factors that have been around for a long time, but are just mounting to the point where we confront this real sense of crisis today. One of them is simply the legal basis of the refugee regime, which is territorial asylum, which requires refugees to be physically present in a country before they can claim international protection from that country. And it has become more and more difficult for refugees to access the territories where they wish to claim asylum. A second factor is the lack of solutions. I referred just a moment ago to the fact that so many refugees, half of those under UNHCR's mandate, are in protracted situations, which UNHCR defines as people who've been displaced for 5 years or more. It's not these numbers, the 60 million displaced, are not simply the result of new displacements, although those are occurring at a very high rate today, but also the fact that very few refugees have been able to go home or have found another durable solution to their plight, being able to become permanent residents in another country or integrate in the country of first asylum. So the lack of solutions, along with new displacement, has produced these tremendous numbers which are placing the system under such strain. Another factor is the complex mix of people who are fleeing across borders, some of whom are refugees and have a claim to international protection, and some are migrants who don't have that legal claim, but who nonetheless find themselves in very difficult situations that for them amount to a compulsion to leave their countries. But there's no international regime to protect forced migrants who don't fall into the category of refugees. Fourth factor I'd point to is the very high cost, along with the inadequate financing of caring for refugee populations in countries of first asylum. When you have a country like Turkey with 2 million Iraqi and Syrian refugees, a country like Kenya, which has had a large population of Somali refugees for more than 20 years now. These are poor countries which face struggles in caring for and providing employment for their own people, and international assistance has simply not been adequate to allow them to care for refugees in the way that would meet international standards. And finally, a topic that we're going to get into today also is what I've called enforced immobility. That is, once a refugee manages to cross a border and is assumed to be a refugee, as anyone leaving Syria these days, almost anyone from Syria is assumed to be a refugee right off the bat, they're expected to stay in the first safe country that they reach, even if the quality of protection that they find there is very, very poor. That is, their kids can't be in school, they can't find work, they have great difficulty finding any kind of adequate shelter, And so the natural impulse for many of them is to try to move on to a place where they can find better prospects. But that kind of onward travel is stigmatized. There are few legal channels for people to move on. So the combination of all these factors with the rising numbers, the inadequate resources, has been to really create great pressure to look for innovative solutions. And two of those are going to be the focus of our conversations today with Betsy and with Katie. We'll start with Betsy, who's going to talk about development approaches to protection and assistance to refugees, or what's more commonly known today as a livelihoods approach. Actually, I think we're going to do this in reverse order. We're going to start with Kate. Sorry, we had a minor technical difficulty. We are going to start with Betsy, who's going to talk about the livelihoods approach, and then we're going to move to Katie, who's going to talk about the ways in which greater access to international mobility can assist refugees and other displaced people. So I'm very pleased to introduce again Betsy Littman, the Chief of the Operational Solutions and Transition section at UNHCR. Betsy, over to you. Are you with us, Betsy? I see her not. So Katie, if you don't mind, we will move on to talk about mobility approaches, those that seek to integrate refugees more fully into migration regimes, into labor markets, and regional mobility schemes. So could I ask you to make a few comments before we start our conversation? Please bear with us for just a moment while we try to overcome our technical difficulty in connecting with our speakers. I'm sure that many of you have been following one of the most dramatic manifestations of this crisis of protection and assistance for refugees, which is the situation in the Mediterranean currently, where well over 100,000 people have made unauthorized crossings in the last 6 months, and many of those people are exactly the population that we're talking about here, those who have fled from war zones like Syria for situations of severe human rights abuses and government repression, as in Syria. These are people who are who have very high recognition rates as refugees if they do manage to access the asylum system in Europe, and yet the fact that they are forced to make these sort of dangerous, very costly journeys by sea across the Mediterranean is an illustration of the lack of adequate channels for people to claim asylum, to seek more satisfactory situations without resorting to smugglers, putting themselves in the hands of criminal syndicates in order to access a place of safety. Those flows across the Mediterranean have really concentrated the minds, I think, of many European governments to think about alternative forms of protection, including looking at ways that refugees might be able to not only to sustain themselves, but to be able to contribute to the economies of their countries of transit and countries of destination, so that they will be seen not as burdens, but indeed as contributors to those economies. But the blockages between that impulse to get to a place of safety and the ability to be recognized as a refugee or welcomed as a labor migrant who has something to contribute is formidable, and we're seeing in the European context a focus now on rescuing people at sea, sort of following the humanitarian impulse to prevent deaths, but also hi Betsy, are you rejoining us?
Okay, you can hear me now. Great.
Yes, I can hear you now, and let me just sort of finish the thought. I was just pointing to the crisis in the Mediterranean Sea, the migration crisis in the Mediterranean, as an example of the kind of desperate measures that people are forced into when they find that their possibilities for livelihoods in countries of first asylum are so limited. So it would be great to turn this over to you now to talk a bit about UNHCR's approaches to livelihoods.
Okay, great, Kathleen. Glad everybody hopefully can hear me now.
Yes.
So I appreciate you setting the stage, and I think it's a very different time for us now in addressing these situations. As you said, the number of protracted situations that we're working with, the number of people in protracted situations is enormous. So I think two things have really changed. One is our relationship with development actors in general, most specifically the World Bank, which I can touch on later if people have questions. And in terms of livelihoods, I think what has changed is our approach to livelihoods being something that's short-term. Livelihoods is not a short-term endeavor, and we have really, over the last couple of years, looked towards a much more market-oriented approach towards livelihoods, and in terms of changing the types of partners that we're working with. We now have just sent out to all of our operations something called the minimum criteria, which operations must follow by the end of 2016, or else they will not be able to program money anymore. And they're basically common sense. Before you design your program, you have to do a market survey. You have to not train 1,000 carpenters anymore if there will not be jobs. There was just a report that came out by the World Bank that looked at the amount of money that's wasted, not just by humanitarian organizations, but many others, on vocational training. Vocational training should be tied to a market assessment to know that you're training people for the labor market. The criteria also include things like doing a mapping of partners in the country. We have very typical partners that we work with, but many of them are not experts in what I would call more development economy. It's more a very humanitarian short-term approach to livelihood. So, for example, in Rwanda now, we're trying to partner with One Acre Fund, which some people may know has quite a good track record, somewhere around 95 to 96% success rate with small farmers and increasing their yield. And it's a development approach, and that's exactly the approach that we're trying to take. We've incorporated something called the graduation model, which is a model that comes out of work around microfinance in Bangladesh with BRAC. And it's a model that doesn't just incorporate microfinance, but mentoring, training in a very phased approach over a year to a year and a half to raise people above the poverty line. And we've piloted this now in urban areas in Cairo, in Costa Rica, and in Ecuador, and we're starting some rural pilots now in Burkina Faso and in Zambia. And this was also just written up in the New York Times. This has been studied using gold standard, randomized controlled trials, and the approach works. It works in the development world, and it will work with refugee populations. So I think it's a real change in how we're approaching livelihoods in the organization.
That is so interesting and really encouraging, because it's become clear in the last few years that there's just not enough money in the world to sustain, the traditional care and maintenance model, which is not only expensive but sort of forces people into dependence and passivity, where their skills atrophy and they are idle and unwillingly idle. So it's a very encouraging picture that you paint. I wanted to ask, how are the host communities reacting to this model? Is there a danger there of refugees being seen as sort of privileged over local residents who are seeing refugees coming in to settle in their communities?
I think, it really depends on the kind of research you do and how you develop your program. And I'm sure, as you know and others do, UNHCR has always taken the approach that you need to look at the community. It can't just be assistance for refugees. And oftentimes, even just in basic assistance, we find that, for example, schools that were meant to support refugees, there's just as many host community children attending those schools, attending the health clinics. And it's the same approach for livelihoods. We have a project now in Burkina Faso looking at artisans. We have refugees from Mali who are very skilled in leather work. And when we did our analysis of the market there, we realized that their skill set is quite different from the local population, but that artisan work makes up 20% of Burkina Faso's GDP, and that the Swiss and the Austrians fund, through government vocational training centers, upskilling of people around artisan work, and that refugees have access to these vocational training courses, as do local populations. And if you look at a whole value chain, it might mean that in part of that value chain you might be buying some of your materials from the local population, so you're actually supporting the local economy. So, I mean, in recognizing that you don't want to disrupt the local economy and create competition, I think you have to be strategic. We also have a milk value chain project in Burkina Faso, again, with Vétérinaires Sans Frontières. It's part of the government's development plan around this particular value chain, and the cooperatives that are being formed are joint local population and refugee population.
Very interesting. This is so much more sophisticated a concept than the first, I remember, 20 years ago, the sort of early discussions about bridging the gap between humanitarian and development assistance. So the sort of basic concept has been around for a long time, but this is really a very different approach now. What do you think accounts for that change? Is it just the financial pressure on the sort of refugee regime, or has something changed in UNHCR, or is this a matter of sort of learning from experience of what works and what doesn't work?
Yeah, I think it's not just one thing. I think it's a coalescence of a number of things. One, I think, is a real recognition by many people now that displacement is a development issue. And as you mentioned, it's clearly seen in the case of Lebanon, where 1 out of every 4 people is a refugee. What's happening in Lebanon with this influx of people is clearly impacting the development progress in the country. So, and when you have the engagement of someone like the World Bank looking at poverty levels and how this will impact in the future and the impact of the refugees on the economy, et cetera, the same across the whole region, I think, there's a recognition that we have to look at displacement differently. I would also say in UNHCR there is a change. It's very different than it was, 10 or 15 years ago. The new policy on alternative to camps is a recognition of that. Again, as you said, to not keep people captive in a particular place. The first approach should be an alternative to camp policy where refugees are part of a geographic area and the support goes to the geographic area. And everybody benefits, and that's much more productive in the long run because you don't put refugees in a place where they're dependent. You help them to maintain their skill sets, you give them agency and hope, and hopefully you're able to demonstrate the value added of the refugees to that particular area. So I think, I think it's a number of things that came together all at once.
It really is a very marked departure from sort of past policies, and that must be true on the development side of this equation as well as among the humanitarian agencies like UNHCR, with greater receptivity in the World Bank and other sort of donor governments. Do you feel like this is that this is a change that is entrenched, that it's something that is really becoming institutionalized? You know, we've seen approaches sort of come and go, but is this one here to stay, in your opinion?
I think this is here to stay. I think, you know, I just can't see us taking a step back from this, in the sense that, you know, like you say, it's also resource-driven, but it's also logical. You know, there isn't really a gap between humanitarian development. It's that you're imposing sometimes a humanitarian situation on a development context. You know, you do have emergency needs, but, you know, how do we define whether shelter is humanitarian or development? Does it depend on the durability of the shelter? And does it make sense when we know that people are in places for 17 years to continue to give tents, which you have to replace, and which don't really provide people with the dignity that they deserve? And I think it's important that we have these discussions with host governments. We have some host governments who are very open to this. Zambia, as you know, has agreed to integrate the Angolans, give them legal status and land. In Tanzania, the government has agreed to integrate the former Burundian refugees. And I think part of the reason is they see the value added economically of this population as well. The local community and the local leaders in Zambia have said that these Congolese are very good farmers and they can help to drive the economy. So yeah, I think we have to have much more nuanced discussions, and we have to have much more information and data. And so we are, both in the livelihoods and on the development side, taking a very data-driven approach, working with the World Bank and their ability to do some of the analysis. And on our own, we've issued recently a request for proposals that we will now agree to, I think 3, to look at the economic impact of refugees on certain situations so that we can have more nuanced discussions with governments, and also in terms of informing our programming.
That's going to be really interesting to see how those research results turn up in the next few years. I'd like to draw Katie into the conversation if she's online with us. Katie, can you hear us? Apparently not yet. So let's carry on with our discussion with Betsy. Development actors have often been, you know, very reluctant to get involved with refugee populations because of the political aspects of the situation, and have seen that as sort of being outside of their remit. Refugee situations are sort of inherently political. And are there places in which UNHCR just finds that it's not possible to pursue this kind of livelihoods approach because of resistance by host governments, or indeed by the refugees themselves who want to sort of maintain the idea that they will be going home soon?
I mean, I think it's very much a case-by-case situation. You know, there are places where refugees do not have the right to work. Lebanon is a case in point right now where it's quite difficult, and yet we know that refugees are working. Again, I think that, you know, it may take larger, more economic actors, private sectors, to say, how do we take advantage of this additional population to increase? Oops, hello?
Hello, it's Katie here.
Oh, hi, Katie. Glad you're with us. We'll come to you in a moment.
Yes, great.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll just finish my thought, Kathleen. Yeah. You know, to make the case for how the refugees can increase, you know, the economic pie there, and an example that I would give is we know that the Syrians are furniture,
we seem to,
woodwork, and everything in Syria. And so how can we utilize that population in Lebanon to increase the market share for the country in those products? And, you know, we haven't gotten there yet. I think, you know, over the next couple of years, because the population is not going home anytime soon, you know, I think that that's possible. And yes, there are places where some populations feel maybe not so much that they can go home, but they're looking to be resettled. And as you know, that's less than 1% of the population that actually gets resettlement in a third country. So, you know, our objective is to say to everybody, look, whether you're resettled, whether you go home, whether you stay where you are, really working on your livelihood skills is important. It doesn't matter what the solution will be. So
wherever you end up, you're going to need these
wherever
skills.
you end up, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, that makes a very good segue into the work that Katie has been doing on how mobility fits into this occasion. Katie, you've written that, and I quote here, that recognizing that mobility plays a key role in how most refugees respond to displacement is likely to prove crucial to the future maintenance and functioning of the international refugee protection regime. Could you expand on that a little bit and talk about
absolutely.
how? Yeah, thanks.
So I'm glad you can hear me. First of all, I mean, I think this really comes to the heart of, and it was really interesting listening to Betsy talk about the livelihood and development approach seeping into UNHCR's responses. But in a way, a lot of the work I've been doing on this really over the last 5 or 6 years is trying to rethink what it means to be a refugee long term, and you talked about this question of immobility once you've crossed the border, and there's this tendency traditionally to sort of expect refugees to stay put and be dependent fundamentally on international aid, and you know, we see solutions aren't available for the majority of refugees, and therefore there's a need to recognize that what happens in practice is that actually refugees are already using mobility and migratory practices. And in other words, you know, part of thinking about how labor mobility might help to rethink displacement solutions is actually recognizing what's already going on in the margins, perhaps, of the sort of the international community's responses. You know, in many areas where we see large-scale displacement, you have long-standing traditional socioeconomic patterns of labor migration, places like Afghanistan into Pakistan and Iran, or West African refugees moving through to Nigeria. You know, this idea of moving into larger economies, often seasonally, sometimes temporarily, often predates conflict, and is certainly something that as conflict is resolved is quite clearly what happens in terms of people returning, but actually keeping perhaps one breadwinner in a larger economy, if that's where there's been a host community, people perhaps moving back and forth across the border. Alternatively, we sometimes see people moving into displacement physically, but actually returning several times a year to perhaps collect rents or access other goods that aren't portable. You know, it's this kind of commuter displacement almost. So in many ways, part of the main motivation for me in trying to encourage this idea that we should be thinking about how mobility plays into protection is recognizing that this is how people are already responding. And rather than seeing that as a problem, which I think has been the traditional approach, trying to incorporate it into protection models, thinking about how the international community can move some of that movement away from being irregular and illegal, and with the risks and exploitation and problems for host communities that entails, and recognize that actually some of this mobility could be an opportunity to actually solve some long-standing displacement and perhaps offer enhanced opportunities for economic gain during displacement as well, perhaps through temporary migration patterns.
Yes, that's sort of one of the problems that I know you've looked at, the problems that refugees have, refugees and other displaced people, but let's talk about refugees for the moment. in gaining access even to the sort of normal channels of labor mobility. Often refugees don't have travel documents, or they can't get to a consulate to apply for a visa. So even if they have skills that would be in demand on the labor market, on the international labor market, it's hard for them to sort of enter those channels. Have you thought about ways of making that easier?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the aspects which is in some ways a sort of small step approach, an area where that might be possible. And clearly we're talking about a relatively small subset of the refugee population who have the sort of mid-skill level that the international labor market is actually open to them moving as migrants and refugees. It's important to recognize that, but I don't think that means it's less important to consider how the barriers which are actually removing, the barriers which are actually preventing these refugees from being able to migrate could be removed. Probably the key one is actually this issue around the country of return. If you're a refugee, the fundamental protection that you need is a protection against being returned to your country of origin because you fear persecution, non-refoulement. How does that work if you're a labor migrant? Most labor migrants are admitted on the basis that if they commit a crime, for instance, or sometimes in certain settings, if they lose their job for more than a number of weeks, they will be expected to leave the country. And that conditionality is obviously problematic if you're talking about a refugee. Where do they go? So I think that question of are countries prepared to waive that and perhaps move more quickly to offering permanent residency, in effect, to refugees who might otherwise meet labor migrant criteria? Are they prepared to work with country of origin host communities to perhaps, particularly at the end of a refugee crisis where you have some repatriation occurring already and perhaps some of the reasons why return is unthinkable are being removed? Is there an opportunity there to actually work perhaps some forms of labor migration into tripartite agreements, for instance, for return? I think there are a number of other smaller, more bureaucratic improvements, I suppose, or innovations that could occur. Convention travel documents have long been recognized to be problematic. Clearly, there's opportunities there to reform the document system and bring it into line with modern 21st travel requirements and border security.
The document that a refugee, in theory, has access to if they don't have access to a national passport.
That's right, yes. Although in practice they're often quite difficult to obtain for refugees on the ground. And I've certainly, during field work, met many refugees who've chosen to travel on alternative documents, either legally or obtained on the back market, because the convention travel document is seen as so problematic. And I think probably, certainly people I've spoken to at UNHCR also acknowledge that it's not kept up with the shift in things like biometric data at the speed which has been needed to really keep it at the center of the refugee regime. And, I think part of this as well, it's interesting to look back, these questions around country of return, around documentation, around, how to finance the initial move to a country of labor migration have been questions that were really being talked about in the 1920s when refugee crises were first on the international community agenda. It was really all these types of questions that we're talking about and these market-based analytical approaches that Betsy was talking about. These ideas are certainly, in that sense, I think they're important, but I almost question to what extent it's about rediscovering the ways that these were dealt with perhaps previously, albeit in a different political context. I think there's a lot we can learn from looking backwards as well as having to reinvent looking forwards.
That's great. Yeah, it's always seemed sort of ironic to me that with the sort of refugee status being seen by many policymakers in countries of first asylum and countries of onward sort of destination, is refugee status being seen as a sort of prize. If people manage to get over a lot of hurdles to access it, but in fact, many people who are fleeing would actually prefer to be migrants, to be able to enter the labor market, to be able to travel for education, or, you know, to have some additional sort of status, as long as they have the basic protection of not being returned to danger.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is there any place, Katie, where you see these mobility approaches getting some traction? Are there examples of good practice coming from some?
Yeah, I think there are a few. I mean, I think it is certainly an area where, in terms of formal large-scale programs, rather than individual refugees managing to find a way through or being helped to perhaps enter a scholarship program, there are relatively few, but there are some quite interesting examples, particularly around, for instance, the use of regional citizenship and existing regional accords. We saw that in West Africa with the Sierra Leonean and Liberian refugees. UNHCR was involved along with the Nigerian government and later some of the other states in the region in setting up essentially work permits, but really using the fact that these were West African citizens under the ECOWAS protocols that already existed to facilitate the mobility. We've also seen some bilateral agreements. One area which has been quite interesting, where I've done quite a bit of work, is on the South Sudanese and Ugandan border, where, again, you see, in fact, bilateral agreements encouraging a great deal of movement, which historically has always been the case across this border. And, in fact, what's interesting is it's the South Sudanese government that has reacted against Ugandans migrating into South Sudan rather than the other way around. But certainly that's been a protection. Yeah, I mean, I think there it's the sort of explosion of work in Juba, which has really created sort of xenophobia from the South Sudanese side, which is quite an interesting example of how bilateral agreements can throw up unexpected things. But it's certainly, in terms of South Sudanese refugees and returnees, it's provided an ability to move across and sort of return gradually back, which, given the insecurity there, has been important. So there are examples there. There's also some examples in the Colombian case with the Mercosur, where similarly regional, broader regional patterns of integration have been used as the basis for trying to provide a framework for allowing refugees to move really as regional citizens. And I think in the long term, it's that regional citizenship which may offer the best opportunity to rethink what it means to be a refugee in some contexts, although, of course, it's also important that non-refoulement protection remains central, and regional citizenship can certainly throw up some complexities in how that might work, which has been a concern that some advocates have voiced in relation to, for instance, the East African community and its move towards integration. You know, what would that mean, for instance, for Rwandese refugees in the region? So it's certainly not without questions, but I think there is a lot of potential there as part of broader development integration, and that's why this development agenda aspect is so important.
Thanks, Katie. And I'd like to move into we've had some questions coming in for both of you, and I'll start with one that is directed to Betsy. And the question is, how might we apply these approaches, that is, well, actually it's for both of you because it's livelihood and mobility, for refugees and migrants in need of more immediate support or protection in their host communities? And this questioner has in mind Central American children in the U.S. Who may not be eligible for asylum. So can these approaches, livelihoods or greater mobility, be of help to those populations who are in a sort of very pressing need of assistance? Betsy, are you still with us?
Yeah, I am. Yep. Yeah, I am. You know, it's a difficult question to answer.
Yeah, is it simply a matter that these approaches are not for everyone, but they are,
Yeah, they're not for everyone. I mean, you know, the sort of the basement of our livelihood strategy, and we have a new 5-year strategy on livelihood. The global strategy is, especially for rural communities, but even urban, is food security. So, you know, the not totally quick fix, but the first thing that we need to work on is that people can grow what they need, especially in rural areas. If you're talking about, you know, children in the U.S.,
I think we've lost Betsy, hopefully only temporarily. Katie, do you have a comment on that? It seems to me that that the emergency needs, and this of course would particularly apply to children, but needs in the emergency phase of a refugee flow are probably not so amenable to a livelihoods approach that meeting immediate sort of survival needs has to be a first priority, although ideally, and I think we've seen in the past, that the way that emergency needs are met can have onward implications for dependency or for self-sufficiency. For example, in Lebanon and Jordan, UNHCR and other agencies have been experimenting with cash transfers to refugees. So even, you know, immediately when people arrive and register, rather than being given a ration, a tent or blankets or, you know, a water can, they're given a cash card so that they can buy the things that they need on the local market, and that, of course, is a boon for local merchants, as well as giving the refugees greater choice, greater dignity, greater agency. So I think, you know, that some combination of the way the needs of people who need immediate support and protection, the way that support is provided can segue into a more sort of livelihood-oriented approach. We have another question here, which is, you know, what is the more pressing issue, that so many refugees are not chosen for resettlement, or that countries are ill-equipped to integrate refugees smoothly into labor markets? From this, where can the international community exert the most pressure? I'm afraid we're continuing to have some additional technical difficulties with our speakers.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Betsy, could you hear that question?
I could.
What is the more pressing issue, that so many refugees are not chosen for resettlement, or that countries are ill-equipped to integrate refugees smoothly into labor markets? Any thoughts?
I mean, I think on the resettlement issue, it's not that they're not chosen, it's that the number of places that are given worldwide by countries who are willing to resettle in a third country is limited, and it's not even 1% of the population. So, I mean, that is an issue, that we're not going to resettle, you know, 50 million people. But I think, you know, the more important issue is the right to work. And it is part of the convention, getting countries of asylum to allow refugees to work. And as I said, trying to make the case for how the refugees can help to build the economy. And I think that's a much more pressing issue, because if they don't have the right to work, then they're only working in the informal market, and they have no protections. And it would be much better if it could be a recognized right where we can develop programs around that incorporate the local community. But, for example,
Hi, Katie. Hold on, we'll come to you in a moment, Katie.
Okay.
That's great.
Our hands are tied, for example, in the Lebanon scenario, because refugees don't have the right to work, and we can't develop programming that would incorporate them. So it makes it much more difficult. So I would say, what can we do? We can really encourage and advocate for the right to work.
Yeah, and as you say, that is in the Refugee Convention, and I think we often tend to forget that 4 out of the 7 chapters of the Refugee Convention lay out obligations that states have on, not just on protection, access to employment and access to welfare programs and property rights and rights of association and all of those things. And those that sort of middle part of the convention is not so often discussed, and states are not held to the same account as they are on the basic reform law obligations. Katie, part of that question that we just had was, is the problem that countries are ill-equipped to integrate refugees smoothly into labor markets. And we certainly, see some issues of that in resettled populations. But what are your thoughts on that? Where can the international community exert the most pressure on?
In terms of increasing resettlement numbers, or in terms of integrating better those who are resettled? Was that was
yes, either or both of those.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there clearly are issues with integration of resettled refugees. I mean, my own opinion is partly that is partly a function of the way that resettlement works, in that, resettlement has tended, for a whole host of different historical, political, humanitarian reasons, not to focus always on those who are perhaps most equipped to integrate into the labor market, certainly, partly because of humanitarian need and labor market fit don't necessarily come together. And I think there is certainly a case to say that one of the things that should be happening is to complement, to make it clearer that resettlement may be a humanitarian channel where perhaps expectations around labor market integration should be perhaps less, and to open up complementary, supplementary channels where there is much greater focus on this idea of market fit, and recognizing that many of those who often are very angry about the way resettlement works in refugee camps as well, because they feel that they are excluded from that opportunity of migrating legally to the West, which is how they would often characterize resettlement. So I think that my answer would perhaps be to, absolutely, we do need to think about how to bring more refugees in, but if we're doing that, we also need to perhaps put pressure on states to think about refugees as potential migrants, and not to separate those two categories quite so absolutely, and that might start to bring us some way towards beginning to recognize that there are problems with resettlement if you're expecting it to deliver all things to everybody, but it doesn't mean it doesn't have a crucial function. And at the same time, there are a lot of opportunities to bring refugees who may have a better labor market fit, and may also be able to then offer remittances and other forms of support back, and that this multiplier effect that are being lost because they are also not perhaps being engaged enough by existing resettlement processes.
Yeah,
Kathleen, can I just add on to that, maybe?
Yes,
just
surely.
Another point.
Surely.
What's interesting, I think, is the fact that, we have barely enough money to do livelihoods for those people who aren't resettled. But if we had additional resources, we could work, for example, with refugees who are going to the U.S. with the private sector there to identify what are their labor needs that could be filled. A lot of people come in at the much lower level, but you can train people for that, working in hotels, et cetera. We don't have the resources to be able to do it. I think there's an experiment to try and do this with some of the private sector in Texas, but it costs to do that training in the country of asylum. And the problem is these people are already going to be resettled. So in some ways they've quote unquote won the lottery. They get to go to another country, whereas we have so many other people who don't have another option at that point in time. So where do we put limited resources? And it's something that we have thought about, And I think we could work on it if we did have the resources to be able to do it, so that they could integrate better into the labor markets.
That's one hopes that that there will be, that the path of innovation will really take in some of those possibilities also, because the potential really does seem to be tremendous when you think of the waste of human resources that is embodied in people sort of sitting as refugees, unable to use their talents and energies. Let me go to another question, which I think I can sort of answer fairly quickly. The question is, to what extent have asylum and refugee issues been brought up within the Global Forum for Migration and Development, and is this an appropriate venue to discuss these matters? As I've been very involved with the GFMD, I can say that asylum and refugee issues have not been brought up in the GFMD, and that's been quite a conscious decision by the governments participating, who feel that there are other fora, the High Commissioner's Dialogue, the Executive Committee of UNHCR, where states are able to discuss refugee and asylum issues. But so they haven't been part of the GFMD. I will say, however, that this year, for the first time under the Turkish chair, that there is a roundtable on forced migration and sort of development approaches to dealing with forced migration, people who are not necessarily refugees, but who have left their countries under some degree of compulsion and feel unable to go back. So there's a slight sort of opening toward this range of issues, if not in the GFMD this year, if not specifically on refugee and asylum issues. So let me go to another question that has come in, which is regarding the political aspects of a livelihoods approach, alternatives to camps, and encouraging mobility with countries of asylum like Kenya, who are extremely resistant. What role does UNHCR play in influencing those governmental actors? And so I don't know to what extent you feel that you can expand on that, Betsy, but
I mean, I think again our role is a role of convener and advocate, and again, as I said, we have, in order to make the case, we really have to have the data. It can't be anecdotal. I mean, when we want to speak with the government and demonstrate why this makes sense, not just for the refugee population, but for the host population, and particularly for a region, we need to come with a strong argument that has, numbers in it. For example, right now we're looking at in Ethiopia, Doloado, in the southern area with the camps for the Somalis, and we've negotiated with the government there access to 5,000 hectares. Refugees cannot own land, but they can work the land, and in concert with the local population, we can build the agricultural base in that region of Ethiopia. And we're now looking at this with other actors who are much more development-oriented in Ethiopia, who are working with the government on their food security policy and looking at different value chains for different parts of Ethiopia to build the economy. So, and we've advocated on behalf of this with the government. And as people may know, in Ethiopia, it's fairly restrictive in terms of refugee movement, but we've been able to get access to a large amount of land for people to work with. So I think that our role is to consistently advocate, to make sure that it's data driven, and to seize any opportunities, and to work with other actors that can advocate also on behalf of refugees, the private sector, the development actors like the World Bank, and not to give up.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Katie, do you have any thoughts on that? I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap up shortly.
Yeah. I mean, I think that Betsy's obviously better placed in many ways to talk about what UNHCR is able or not to do. I think there is a problem, and Kenya is an interesting example, of course, of somewhere where you see little Nairobi and you sleep Little Mogadishu in Nairobi and Eastleigh, and a real policy and politics driven, which makes very little economic sense. And I think that lack of political will to really engage with the reality of protracted refugee situations is probably the biggest obstacle that is faced in trying to move towards more innovative approaches, not just in the Kenyan context, but in a number of situations globally.
Which implies a role for advocates other than UNHCR,
Absolutely. Yes,
you know,
non-operational, I think.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you both very much, and I apologize for the number of questions that have come in the last few minutes, which we won't have time to get to. But I thank the audience for your engagement and apologize for our technical difficulties. And want to really extend my thanks to Betsy and to Katie for their very thoughtful comments and for the work that both of them are doing. So as I mentioned earlier, the audio and the slides from today's call will be available on our website later today. The reports that we've referenced are also available at migrationpolicy.org. And if there are reporters on the call who have further questions, please call Michelle Middlestat at MPI. Her number is 202-266-1910. Thank you all very much, and we look forward to having you join us at our next webinar.
Thank you, Kathleen.
Thank you.